Hi everyone, Phil Travis here, your instructor here at ANU. Uh, each week I'm going to try to do some short recorded presentations that cover some of the basic topics that we're dealing with in the class. And so this being week one, I wanted to introduce just kind of some basic aspects of ethics. So to begin with, before I talk about what you see on the screen here, um, ethics is a branch of philosophy. Philosophy as a word means the love of wisdom. And so philosophy and philosophers are interested in understanding the basic structures that ground our society. Some philosophers deal in metaphysics, which is the idea of understanding um, the true nature of reality, if you will. Others look more at epistemology, understanding what knowledge is, how do we know, and how do we obtain knowledge, what is knowledge, and so forth, truth. Others, and obviously many philosophers deal with all of these, but others deal primarily with ethical theories, morality. When we think about ethics, we're talking about um, how humans should um, behave within their society. Ethics are the fundamental structure that really creates the fabric of our society, that creates the principles of what is right and wrong in our society, and really prevents human society from descending into chaos. So we're going to look at a few branches of ethics early on, particularly next week and this week. One of these is a teleological branch. Sometimes you can also, probably maybe the better way of understanding the teleological school of ethics is as a consequentialist theory. And that's probably the best because the way to understand a teleological or a consequentialist theory is simply that these are ethical theories that say that what is the right action, what is the morally right action, is based on the consequences of the action. So the consequences that are brought out by the action. So whether or not a choice is right or wrong for a consequentialist theorist are based on whether or not the actions are good or not, if that makes sense. So everyone who's a consequentialist theorist, of course, does not agree. And the two big strands that we'll be looking at in this class are ethical egoism, and there's different branches of this. Of course, there's universal ethical egoism, rational ethical egoism, but for our purposes, we're just going to simply look at it ethical egoism and utilitarianism. Ethical egoism is the ethical theory. And remember, ethical theories are the ideas about what structures, what is right action within society. What is the action that people should be doing in society to create a just and harmonious society? Ethical egoism is the basic theory that what is morally right is the action that is done out of a person's own rational self-interest. The picture to the edge of the screen is a picture of Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand is, or I was, of course she's passed, but remains the primary figurehead for many when it comes to considering the rational ethical egoist school. Ayn Rand was a Russian immigrant to the United States in the 20th century and was highly influential on um, Americans in American politics and economics theory in the United States. If you remember Alan Greenspan, the um, the former Federal Reserve chairman, um, leading up to the crash of 2008 and throughout the 90s, of course, Alan Greenspan was a noted proponent of Ayn Rand. Um, he was basically one of her. Um, well, he wasn't a direct understudy, but in a way, he would have considered Ayn Rand a mentor. An ethical egoist says that for society, how you organize society should be based on individuals, rational individuals exercising their own self-interest. And so, as a result of that theory, ethical egoists tend to be in favor of, of government programs that um, do not interfere with the individual, that allow, so to speak, the chips to fall as they may, that allow the economic system of capitalism to kind of run its course, and ethical egoists tend to resist government interference because they believe that what is the moral and just action is for an individual to act on his own rational self-interest. And of course, that theory has problems because individuals' rational self-interest will contradict. And in order for an ethical theory to be truly sound, it has to be an ethical theory that can be practiced by all people all the time. It can't contradict itself. And the fact that ethical egoism is contradictory in nature is one of the big problems with it, because two rational thinkers could both pursue their own self-interest, but that self-interest could in fact be fundamentally contradictory, which is one of the problems for this theory. But Ayn Rand's theory of ethical egoism, that individuals should act in their own personal self-interest without consideration for the greater good or something like this, is a very, very influential theory, particularly when it comes to political figures and economic figures who promote small government and deregulation in society. They believe that individuals should not be in any way, shape, or form infringed upon exercising their own self-interest. The other, which was proposed largely by figures like Jeremy Bentham, but also John Stuart Mill, who's pictured here, utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is the idea that the moral right action is the action that brings about the greatest good. So for an ethical egoist, the moral action is the action that maximizes self-interest. For utilitarian, the greatest good is the consequence of bringing about the greatest good is actually the moral or right action. John Stuart Mill wrote in the 1800s a very famous treatise known as titled On Liberty. And utilitarianism is very influential in many of the principles that might be found with social democracy or reform socialism. The idea that the types of actions that a government should be doing are actions that will bring about the greatest good of society. So, for example, if you were to take an issue, let's say a factory that or a chemical company that is maybe putting some things in the water that's potentially harmful to a lot of people, a utilitarian would say you pass laws to prevent the chemical factory from negatively harming the most amount of people. An ethical egoist would usually say that the chemical company is a private, individually run corporation and should be left alone and allowed to pursue its own self-interest. That's one just kind of brief example of how the two might fall in terms of a ethical decision in our society today. But so two different branches of consequentialist theory. Ethical egoism, the right action is the one that brings about the consequence of self-interest. And utilitarianism, the right action is the one that brings about the consequence of the greatest good. Those are the things that justify or make an action, the right, morally right action. The other or another, these are not all. This is kind of a brief overview, but deontological or non-consequentialist theories are exactly what they sound like. They're theories that suggest that ethics or what makes an action right, what makes an action a morally right action, is not about the consequences that are brought about, but rather following universal principles of duty and ethically right action. So Immanuel Kant is one of the primary proponents of a non-consequentialist theory. Immanuel Kant was a great philosopher and thinker in the 18th century. He was from what is basically a part of modern Germany today. And Immanuel Kant believed that there was a universal duty ethic that was basically that all people sort of innately knew, that it was ingrained in existence, and that people had a responsibility to follow this duty. And that what made action ethical for Immanuel Kant was not the consequences that it brought about, but what made it ethical was whether or not it was being done because a person was was doing their duty. So Kant's theory is a little bit interesting because Kant believes that there's a universal kind of ethical theory that is binding on all people. Kant would ultimately say that it comes from God, basically. But this universal ethical theory that's binding on all people, for Kant, if you were to, let's say you were to save a drowning child from a river, but the motivation for you saving the child was in part that maybe you'll get your face in the paper or something like this, or you'll get a reward. Kant would say that's not an ethical action, or that's not a morally right action. At best, it's an amoral action. For Kant, the only morally right action is the action that is done because you know it's the right action. So right action is done because of a sense of duty, and only when there is a sense of duty, only when you are acting for that duty, is it actually a morally right action. In many cases, if you did it and it wasn't for duty, even if the consequences might be considered, just, if you did not do it for duty, it's at best an amoral action. Amoral is a term that means basically um, without morality. So you can have an immoral action. An immoral action means it's an ethically unjust action. A moral action, it means that it's a moral just action. An amoral action is an action um, that is absent of a particular right or wrong. So Kant would say if you're not doing it for duty and the consequences were perhaps just, it's still only an amoral action. And of course, if you do the wrong thing that goes against duty, it would be an immoral action. So for Kant and other thinkers that we're going to read about, um, he's a non-consequentialist theorist, meaning that what makes an action right or wrong is what is not about the consequences that brought it about, like a utilitarian or an ethical egoist, but rather because it's done for a particular sense of duty. Other important concepts, and last slide, I won't keep you guys too long, but other important concepts that we're going to deal with in the class: relativism, particularly the one we're going to think about most is universal relativism and cultural relativism. Relativism suggests that um, moral codes and ethical codes are relative to societies and culture. And in some respect, this is very simple, and on the surface, it makes a lot of sense. After all, ethical codes are, in fact, human constructs. People do make up ethical codes. Now, of course, Immanuel Kant would not agree with that exactly, but nonetheless, generally it's accepted today that the rules that we abide by in society, or in a religious community, are rules that are created by people for particular reasons in organizing their society. So in one sense, it makes very much sense. Of course, different cultures and different societies have different religious beliefs, they have different views on life, and so they naturally construct ethics in a different way. And so that makes sense. However, if you take a universal relativist position and say, therefore, all societies, because they construct their own different moral codes, then it becomes a problem if we universally cannot criticize them because each code is unique in its own right and of a different culture, and there is no universal moral system. Then you have difficulties with how do you condemn atrocities like the Holocaust if if there is no universal sense of ethical duty binding on all humans, like Immanuel Kant said, and in fact it's all just limited to particular cultures and societies and how they view things, then does criticism in the interest of justice and morality become impossible? So that's one of the big questions we'll think about in parts of this class too. Absolutism, which of course is the idea that there are universal laws binding on humanity. In many respects, Kant is an absolutist when it comes to ethical theories of duty. The idea of free will, the idea that humans have the ability to make free choices and can continually create their future through the right choice and the wrong choice. And again, that's a very, on the surface, a very simple and seemingly obvious type of idea. But in fact, it's more complicated than that because there are many components to individuals' lives that they don't dictate and that they can't dictate. There are things that they don't have the ability to change with choice, things that are circumstance, bad luck, chance. And so free will is a concept that we very much like to refer to, the idea that you made your choices and you can make any other choice. We very much humans like to refer to this. But when we consider the chain of causality in human life, free will becomes very difficult to find sometimes because um, so many choices are dictated by various factors that we actually cannot control. And then, of course, on the other side of free will, another concept we'll be talking a little bit about in this class is the concept of determinism. And likewise, this is problematic. Determinism is the idea that all results are brought about by things that are out of people's hands and out of control. Therefore, there is no freedom, but rather things are determined, predetermined. Um, some people, without even knowing it, become fatalists. A fatalist is a person who says, well, if it's my time to die, it's my time to die. There's nothing I can do to change that. Fatalism in that respect is an extreme form of determinism, believing that fate, believing that the future is somehow predetermined. So these are some of the major concepts we're going to be talking about in this class. I don't want to keep you guys too long now. I went a little bit long, and I hope this is helpful. And certainly let me know if you have any questions. All right, thanks, guys.